There is a specific kind of silence that settles over a wiki page when the writers themselves never gave it an answer. You can feel it if you have ever gone looking. A character does something, a relationship ends, a villain is defeated and sent somewhere, and then the page just stops. No explanation follows. Sometimes there is a line, almost apologetic in its plainness, that simply says, "The reason was never revealed." Regular show, for all its warmth, is full of those silences. Tonight is not about the theories that have already been turned over 1,000 times. The Pops and Anti-Pops cosmology, the meaning of the park, the shape of Mordecai's arc. Those have been walked already, carefully, by other nights like this one. Tonight is about the doors the show itself left shut, the threads it picked up with real weight, treated as though they mattered, and then simply let go of, sometimes mid-sentence, sometimes mid-relationship, sometimes mid-war. I am Velvo, and what follows is not speculation dressed up as fact. Where something is confirmed, I will tell you plainly that it is confirmed. Where something is a gap the show never filled, I will tell you that too, because the not knowing is the actual subject tonight. Some of what follows will feel small at first, a shrug of a detail, the kind of thing you might have scrolled past 100 times without stopping. Some of it will feel much larger, reaching down into the actual architecture of the show's cosmology, the parts even the wiki itself hedges on. All of it is real, in the sense that matters here, either confirmed directly by the people who made this show, or plainly, honestly marked as still open. So get comfortable, let your eyes go soft, and let's walk into the parts of this show that were built to be finished, and were never finished at all. Start with the smallest one, because it is the kind of loose end that is almost more unsettling for how ordinary it is. Benson, at some point between seasons, mentions that he and Audrey broke up. Audrey is a human woman who lives across the way from him in his apartment complex, someone he had been seeing with a kind of guarded hopefulness that felt, for a character defined by his temper, like a real vulnerability. And then one day, the relationship is simply over. Benson says so, almost in passing, the way people sometimes announce the end of something large as though it were small, and no one in the room presses him on it. Not Mordecai, not Rigby, not the show itself. There is no flashback. There is no argument staged for the audience to weigh. The most common assumption, the one fans have quietly settled into over the years, is that Benson's anger, the very trait that defines nearly every one of his scenes, might have finally cost him something real. But that is inference, not confirmation. Nothing in the text of the show ever says that is what happened. It is entirely possible the writers had a specific reason in mind and simply never found the runway to use it. The kind of thing that happens constantly in animation when a season order runs out before every subplot gets its close. What is left, then, is a strange little absence sitting inside an otherwise very talkative show. Benson complains about everything. He narrates his own frustrations constantly, out loud, to anyone standing nearby. And on the one subject where the audience might have actually learned something tender about him, he goes quiet, and the show lets him. There is a similar shape to the story of Gene, the green vending machine who runs the rival park, East Pines. Gene's introduction comes wrapped entirely in hostility. He and Benson are locked in what the show frames as an old and bitter prank war, the kind of long-running feud that implies history, implies a specific wrong done by one side to the other at some point in the past that neither side has ever quite let go of. The show tells you the war exists. It does not tell you how it started. It never does. Later specials soften Gene considerably, letting him become something closer to an ally, a family man with his own quiet interior life, which makes the original mystery even more curious in hindsight, because it means the writers clearly had more sympathy for Gene than the initial framing suggested, and yet the founding injury between him and Benson, whatever it might have been, simply never surfaces. You are left with two grown men, or two grown appliances, who have spent years sabotaging each other's places of work over something the show trusted you not to ask about. Maybe it was never about anything specific at all. Maybe that is the actual point being made, quietly, without announcing itself, that some rivalries between men who work in similar jobs and secretly resent each other's existence do not need a founding trauma. They can simply exist because pride is enough fuel on its own. That is a reading. It is not a fact the show ever confirms. If you want to comment on this one, go ahead and tell me where you are watching from tonight and what time it is where you are. I like knowing that this video is landing in 100 different rooms at 100 different hours. Some of you at the end of a long day, some of you just starting one on the other side of the world. Drop it in the comments if you feel like it. It does not change anything about what is coming, but it is nice to know the room, even a dark and scattered one, is not empty. Now go a little deeper, because the next one is stranger than a breakup or an unexplained grudge, and it involves a character the show spent years quietly hiding in plain sight. Thomas the intern, not to be confused with Death's demon son of the same name, spends his early seasons as exactly what he appears to be, a background presence, an awkward goat-like young man who shows up, does thankless intern work, and gets almost no focus. J.G. Quintel has said outright that part of the reason for this is structural and almost accidental, that nobody on the writing staff ever really built stories around him because, in his own words, no one ever hangs out with the intern. That is a plain, documented explanation for why he stayed thin as a character for so long. But then the show does something with him that recontextualizes every one of those quiet, uneventful seasons. In the episode that finally turns its attention to him, it is revealed that Thomas is not simply an intern. He is Nikolai, a foreign agent operating undercover inside the park, embedded there as the first stage of an elaborate and frankly absurd plan involving the eventual conquest of the park's land for a larger geopolitical purpose. It plays largely as comedy, a Cold War pastiche dropped into a workplace cartoon, complete with a rival spy posing as one of Benson's love interests. But once the joke lands and the episode ends, the show simply returns Thomas to his old function. He goes back to being the background intern. The revelation is never mentioned again with any weight. He is glimpsed one final time in the 7th season, standing in a crowd during Rigby's graduation, watching in apparent shock as the park dome lifts off into space at the start of the show's final act. And then he is gone. He does not appear in the finale. He is not present at the 25-year reunion where nearly every other recurring character gets some kind of closing image. A man who was revealed, however jokingly, to be a trained foreign operative embedded in the middle of an eventual cosmic battlefield simply vanishes from the narrative without comment. Did Nikolai know what he was standing next to for all those seasons? Did his handlers ever find out what the park actually was and what secretly walked its grounds every day in the shape of a kind, old, lollipop-headed man? The show never asks the question, let alone answers it. And that silence, once you notice it, is hard to stop noticing. CJ's absence from the ending carries a heavier kind of weight because, unlike Thomas, CJ was never a background player. For seasons, She was positioned as one half of the show's central romantic question, a cloud formed woman whose relationship with Mordecai was volatile, intense, and often genuinely painful to watch play out. The show gave her real screen time. It gave her real stakes. It let her grieve and rage and love in ways that made her feel like a fully built person rather than a plot device standing opposite Margaret in a symmetrical love triangle. And then, when the final season sends the park crew into space and the story accelerates toward its ending, CJ is simply not there. She has no scene in the finale. She gets no farewell moment, no final conversation, no acknowledgement on screen of where her arc actually lands. The last confirmed sighting of her within the aired series comes earlier in Rigby's graduation special, where she appears as a tour guide accompanying a group of children, looking on in visible shock as the dome launches into the sky, carrying away nearly everyone she had history with. She never appears again after that shot. Even the 25-year reunion sequence, which goes out of its way to give small character beats to almost the entire supporting cast, leaves her out entirely, save for one small, wordless detail. Among the paintings shown in Mordecai's later gallery career, there is an abstract piece that fans have identified as being of her, a quiet acknowledgement folded into the background of someone else's happy ending. Beyond the show itself, the creative team has spoken about her fate directly, confirming in interviews and fan interactions that CJ went on, in their own internal understanding of the story, to become a professional dodgeball player, and that she simply lost touch with Mordecai, Rigby, Eileen, and Margaret over the years that followed. That is a real, sourced piece of information, not a guess, but notice what kind of information it is. It comes from outside the show, offered afterward, in interviews and social media answers, because the text of regular show itself never actually tells you. The most emotionally loud relationship of the entire series simply stops being narrated, and the explanation for why had to be supplied later by the people who made it, standing outside the frame of the story, looking back in. There is a smaller version of that same shape sitting inside the marriage the show gives Mordecai in its very last minutes. After the montage begins, after David Bowie starts to play and the years begin to fold forward, Mordecai is shown as a grown man, an established painter, standing beside a woman who is clearly his wife. She is a bat. She appears warm, steady, present in the family photograph. The show lingers on at the reunion, and she is never named. Not once. Not in a single line of dialogue, across the entire run of the series. For years, this was simply an open gap, the kind of detail-obsessive fans catalog and argue over, precisely because the show gave them nothing to work with beyond a face and a wedding ring. The answer, when it eventually came, did not come from the show itself. It came from an online question and answer session years after the finale aired, in which head writer Matt Price was asked directly what her name was. His response, by his own account, was almost spontaneous. He offered the name Steph, explaining that the choice was really just an homage to Quintel's fondness for the film The Goonies, and other members of the writing staff have since confirmed there had been no actual plan to name her before that moment. That is a documented fact, sourced directly to the people who wrote the show, and it deserves to be treated with exactly the weight it has, which is to say, the answer exists, but it was invented after the fact, casually, as a kind of afterthought gift to a fandom that had been asking for years. The show ended its central character's romantic arc by handing him a partner the narrative never bothered to name, and the eventual name we do have was less a revealed truth than a small act of generosity extended after the story had already closed its own book. It is worth sitting with what that means. Margaret was written with a surname, a career, a hometown, a personality built across dozens of episodes. CJ was given a full emotional arc with real consequence. And the woman Mordecai actually ends up with, the one the show frames as his true resting place after all that turbulence, exists mostly as an idea, a shape in a final photograph, filled in only because someone, somewhere, finally answered a fan's question on the internet. Push further back toward the show's own mythology, and you find a mystery that is stranger for being buried inside the finale's most triumphant sequence. When the park crew finally arrives on Lollyland, Pops's true homeworld, they are met by three native beings, introduced briefly, treated with a kind of reverence. The show rarely extends to characters it invents for a single episode. Their names are Frivola Cranus, Quadravi Cranus, and a figure fans have simply taken to calling the weird mushroom guy, since the show itself never gives him anything more formal. What makes this genuinely strange, and what elevates it past ordinary last-minute world building, is a fact confirmed by the production side of the story, rather than invented by fans afterward. These three beings were originally early design concepts for Pops himself, alternate versions of the character that Quintel sketched out and ultimately set aside before settling on the lollipop-shaped design that became iconic. Rather than discard those early drawings entirely, the finale folds them back into the story as separate people, residents of Pops's own homeworld, walking reminders of the road not taken, sitting quietly in the background of the very episode where Pops's true nature is finally fully revealed. It is a lovely piece of behind-the-scenes trivia on its own, the kind of detail animation fans treasure, specifically because it lets you see the bones of a creative process usually kept hidden. But it also raises a question the show has no interest in answering. If those three figures are meant to represent other members of Pops's species, other citizens of Lollyland going about their lives on a planet defined entirely by the war between two of its most famous sons, what does that species' culture actually look like beyond three characters glimpsed for a handful of minutes? Is warfare between embodiments of good and evil a routine, expected feature of life there? Do other pairs like Pops and Anti-Pops exist simultaneously elsewhere on the same planet, locked in their own private cosmic stalemates the show never has reason to mention? Nothing in the text answers this. The show shows you exactly enough of Lollyland to make the reveal land emotionally, and not one frame more. The deepest hole in the entire mythology, though, sits at the exact center of the conflict the finale spends itself resolving. Ask plainly why Anti-Pops wants Pops dead, and you will find that the show's own internal documentation is remarkably honest about not having an answer. The most direct explanation offered anywhere in the canon is that the two brothers were born with fundamentally different gifts, Pops as the embodiment of pure good and Anti-Pops as his necessary opposite, a kind of cosmic balancing act built into the fabric of Lollyland's mythology. But the specific reason Anti-Pops chooses cruelty, chooses to actively hunt his brother rather than simply exist as his counterweight, is never dramatized. He does not get an origin episode the way Skips does. He does not get a scene of formative injustice. No moment where you watch something happen to him that explains the particular shape of his hatred. He arrives in the final season, essentially fully formed, already furious, already committed to erasing his brother from existence, and the show trusts the audience to accept that some opposites simply hate each other because the universe requires an opposite to exist. no childhood required. That is, in its own way, a bold storytelling choice. Most shows would feel obligated to humanize a final villain, to give him a wound the audience can recognize and maybe even sympathize with. Regular show largely declines. Antipops gets a single, brief flicker of remorse in his final moments, a small crack in the performance right before he and his brother die together inside a star, and that flicker is the closest thing to psychological explanation the character is ever given. Everything else about why he is the way he is remains, by the show's own admission, through the accumulated silence of 8 seasons, simply unrevealed. Clorgbane's story ends in an even more literal kind of incompletion, because his story was never actually allowed to finish on the show's own terms. Remember the shape of the deal that gave Skips his immortality in the first place. The Guardians of Eternal Youth grant Walks eternal youth specifically because Clorgbane, the villain who killed Mona, is fated to return every 157 years, and someone needs to be alive and strong enough to meet him each time he does. That is the entire justification for Skips existing the way he does across the run of the show. It is not incidental lore. It is the load-bearing wall underneath one of the most emotionally significant character arcs in the whole series. And yet Clorgbane appears only twice across the entire 8 seasons. Once in the flashback that establishes his history with Mona and Walks, and once more in Fists of Justice, where Mordecai and Rigby, rather than Skips himself, end up being the ones who defeat him using the same enchanted gauntlets from the earlier fight. After that second defeat, Clorgbane is launched away, and the show closes the door on him. He is never seen again. The 157-year cycle that supposedly defines the terms of Skips's entire immortal existence is simply left standing there, a promise the show made to its own internal logic and then had no further use for. Whether the writers always intended Clorgbane to return once more before the series ended, whether a third confrontation was ever seriously discussed in a writer's room and quietly abandoned, as the show moved toward its cosmic Lollyland ending, instead, is not something publicly documented anywhere. What is documented is simply the gap itself, an ancient enemy, a specific timeline, and a story that stops well short of ever paying either off. Before moving further into the show's own supernatural architecture, it is worth noticing how differently these two early mysteries, Anti-Pops's unexplained hatred and Clorgbane's unfinished cycle, actually function within the story that contains them. One sits at the very center of the finale, the thing the entire final season is building toward, and the show simply declines to dramatize its origin. The other sits quietly off to the side, established years earlier as a ticking clock, and the show simply runs out of road before that clock ever finishes its countdown. Different placement, different scale, same basic shape, a promise of explanation, made through the ordinary mechanics of setup and stakes that the text itself never actually cashes in. Sit with Mona a while longer, because her death is one of the only moments in the entire series where the show seems to visibly strain against the limits of what it was allowed to depict. The scene itself moves fast, almost too fast, the way real trauma sometimes does in memory rather than in careful narrative construction. Clorgbane swings, the ceiling cracks, debris falls, and Mona is gone in the space of a few seconds of screen time. What follows is not a body, not a funeral, not a grave the show ever returns to. What follows is a single object, a locket, pulled from the wreckage by one of the Guardians of Eternal Youth and handed silently to a devastated Walks. the necklace he had given her earlier that same night, now serving as the only physical evidence the show offers that she ever existed at all beyond memory. Critics who covered the episode at the time noted this directly, observing that the show never quite shows you enough of the aftermath for the death to fully land as tragedy rather than plot mechanism, and also noting, almost in passing, that the absence of an actual body leaves the door open, however slightly, for some kind of future magical reunion that the show never bothers to walk through. That observation has aged into something closer to a genuine unanswered question. Mona is confirmed dead. The show is not ambiguous about that. But it also never closes the loop on what happens to a soul like hers within the show's own cosmology, a cosmology that includes an active, personified death character with the power to bargain over souls, a character who appears constantly throughout the series, making deals and collecting debts. If Death himself is real and active within this universe, walking around on a motorcycle, negotiating for people's lives in dodgeball tournaments, and eating contests, the show never once has him or anyone else mention what became of Mona's soul specifically, whether it passed on normally, whether it went somewhere Skips might one day be able to visit, or whether it simply dissolved into the same silence that swallows so many of this show's smaller griefs. Skips carries her memory faithfully for centuries. The show trusts that faithfulness completely. It never once follows the thread of where exactly she actually went, which brings the question naturally to Death himself, a character the show treats with an almost domestic ordinariness that becomes stranger the longer you look at it. He is confirmed, plainly and repeatedly across multiple episodes, to have a wife, a marriage, the show frames as loving, despite Death's own casually cruel personality, and a 300-year-old son named Thomas, who disguises himself as an ordinary infant while secretly capable of speech and small, targeted acts of chaos. Death negotiates. He makes wagers. He arm wrestles Skips for the right to collect Rigby's soul in one of his earliest appearances, loses, and honors the loss, which tells you that whatever rules govern his power in this universe, they are rules he considers himself bound by, even when the outcome displeases him. He is visibly, personally frustrated by Skips's immortality, repeatedly promising that he will eventually claim what he sees as a soul rightfully owed to him, and yet the actual mechanics of how Skips's deal with the Guardians of Eternal Youth interacts with Death's own jurisdiction. Whether Death was ever consulted when that deal was struck, whether there exists some higher authority above Death himself, capable of overriding him the way the Guardians apparently can, is never explained. The show is content to let Death exist as a recurring, half-comedic, half-genuinely eerie presence, powerful enough to matter and petty enough to be funny, without ever building out the actual architecture of how death, immortality, and cosmic bargaining coexist as systems in this universe. He simply operates. The rules are implied by his behavior rather than stated by the narrative, and the show never once pulls back the curtain far enough to show you who, if anyone, Death himself answers to. The Guardians of Eternal Youth carry their own version of this same unexamined foundation. 5 infant-shaped beings with deep, mature voices. They are introduced first as figures of genuine, slightly ridiculous authority, granting Skips his immortality in exchange for a yearly ceremonial dance, and later revealed in the flashback episode devoted to Skips's origin to have known Walks and Mona personally as fellow students at the strange, time-displaced high school where the entire tragedy first unfolds. Their leader is eventually named Reginald. The others are named Oswald, Boswald, and Griswold, and one of them, Archibald, is killed permanently during a later confrontation with Clorgbane, a death the show treats with real weight despite Archibald's brief total screen time. What the show never explains is where the Guardians themselves actually come from, what grants them the authority to bestow or revoke immortality in the first place, or what their relationship is to any larger cosmic order beyond the specific conflict with Clorgbane that defines their appearances. They are referred to at times as being connected to something called the Immortal Student Council, a phrase that implies an entire institution, an entire structure of ongoing governance among immortal beings existing somewhere just outside the frame of the show. You catch glimpses of that larger structure. You never get to walk through its halls. The Guardians simply appear when the plot requires cosmic authority to intervene, dispense judgment or reward with the confident ease of people who have done this many times before, and then recede back into whatever realm they occupy between episodes. A realm the show names, but never actually shows you in any real detail. There is a pattern forming now, if you have been paying attention, and it is worth naming directly rather than letting it stay implicit. Character after character in this show gets built up with real specificity, real history, real emotional stakes, and then simply exits the frame without a formal closing. Thomas the intern disappears mid-plot after a spy reveal that goes nowhere. CJ disappears from the ending entirely, her fate confirmed only by outside interviews rather than the text itself. Clorgbane disappears mid-cycle, his 157-year promise left hanging. Mona disappears without a body, without a documented afterlife, without a final scene that tells you where a soul like hers actually goes in a universe that clearly has rules about where souls go. Benson's relationship with Audrey disappears without explanation. Even minor background players, the snack bar workers and hot dog vendors, and various recurring townspeople, the show gives just enough personality to make memorable, tend to simply stop appearing once their specific episode's purpose has been served, with no acknowledgement anywhere that the show noticed their absence. Some of this is simply the ordinary mathematics of long-running animated television, where budgets and season orders, and the natural churn of a writer's room mean that not every dangling thread gets tied off before the credits roll for good. But taken all together, the pattern says something quieter and more specific about how this particular show was built. It was never trying to be an airtight puzzle box, the kind of series where every object introduced in an early season is guaranteed to matter again by the finale. It was building a place, populating that place generously, and trusting the audience to accept that places like that, real ones, are always full of people who simply drift out of your life without a formal goodbye. That is either a genuine strength of the show's design or a genuine flaw in its execution, and honestly, it is probably both, depending on which specific vanished thread you happen to still be thinking about at 2 in the morning. To understand why this show behaves the way it does with its own loose ends, it helps to go back further than the series itself, back to the 2 student films that quietly seeded everything that eventually became regular show. The first is a short called The Naive Man from Lollyland, made while Quintel was still a student, and it is the direct point of origin for Pops as a character, a naive, gentle figure whose entire comic register comes from his total mismatch with the ordinary world around him. Even the planet's name survives intact, carried across more than a decade of development from a small student project into the emotional climax of an 8-season television series. The second short, called 2 in the AM/PM, is stranger and considerably less appropriate for the network the eventual show would air on. It follows two overnight convenience store clerks, voiced by Quintel and Sam Marin, playing versions of themselves, who eat candy they believe is laced with marijuana and are actually dosed with something closer to acid, sending them into a string of increasingly bizarre hallucinations. During those hallucinations, the two clerks briefly transform into recognizable early versions of Mordecai and Benson, Blue Jay and Gumball Machine, appearing here for the first time, not as fully formed characters in their own right, but as drug induced visions inside someone else's overnight shift. The short is considerably more vulgar than anything that made it to air later, and it was never given an official public release, surviving instead through unofficial uploads that fans eventually tracked down and connected to the show's later mythology. What matters here is not merely the trivia of where two familiar designs came from, though that trivia is genuinely confirmed and genuinely worth knowing. What matters is the strange shape of the origin itself. The two characters who would eventually anchor an entire animated series about friendship, growth, and cosmic responsibility began their existence as hallucinations, ungrounded, unstable, appearing and disappearing inside someone else's altered state of consciousness with no promise of narrative permanence at all. Some fans have taken this origin and built an entire secondary reading on top of it, suggesting that the events of regular show itself might represent an extended hallucination experienced by the original clerk character from that short film, a theory that has some surface appeal given the confirmed shared designs, but that remains entirely unconfirmed speculation, never suggested by Quintel or the writing staff as an actual intended reading of the finished show. It is worth naming plainly as exactly that, an appealing pattern noticed by attentive viewers, resting on a real and documented shared design history, extended into a claim about the show's actual nature that the creators themselves have never endorsed. The finale itself, for all its emotional weight, was not built without visible strain, and Quintel has been candid about at least one specific moment where the seams show if you know where to look. When Pops is knocked backward into the frame of the naive man from Lollyland during the climactic battle, the show is attempting something genuinely difficult, recreating the exact footage and style of that decade-old student film well enough that the audience feels the collision between two different eras of the creator's own work. Quintel has described the specific technical problem this created directly. The original student film was edited with cuts. The new scene needed to bridge in a way the old footage was never built to accommodate, meaning the crew, working with an overseas animation team, had to construct entirely new animation designed to imitate the old film's style closely enough to pass as original footage, rather than a modern recreation sitting awkwardly beside it. That is not a mystery in the sense of an unanswered plot question. It is something rarer and in some ways more interesting. A documented moment where the show's creator has openly discussed the mechanical difficulty of building his own ending. The actual seams of production visible from the inside in a way that almost never gets talked about this plainly. It is worth holding on to because it reframes some of what came before. A show capable of leaving Clorgbane's return unresolved, CJ's fate unshown, and Benson's breakup unexplained was not necessarily failing to notice those gaps. It was a show being made under real constraints, real deadlines, real technical limitations, by people who, by their own account, were trying to end something they loved as properly as the circumstances allowed, patching the gaps they could patch and, inevitably, given real production realities, leaving some others simply as they were. And then, years after all of that, after the finale had settled into its reputation as one of the more genuinely committed endings in modern animated television, the door opened again. In 2024, Warner Brothers Discovery announced a revival, eventually titled Regular Show, The Lost Tapes, greenlit for 2 full seasons, with Quintel returning as showrunner and the overwhelming majority of the original voice cast confirmed to return alongside him, including Mark Hamill, reprising Skips, and Sam Marin, returning across his full trio of roles as Benson, Pops, and Muscle Man. The premise, once revealed, turned out to be built directly out of the finale's own closing image. Remember that final shot, Pops, alive in some form of afterlife, watching the entire run of the series back on a VHS tape, simply labeled Regular Show, ejecting it at last with his familiar catchphrase. The revival takes that image and treats it as an actual narrative mechanism rather than a poetic closing flourish. The new series is framed as previously unseen material recovered from within that same body of tapes, stories that existed alongside the original 8 seasons but were never shown, filling in gaps rather than overwriting or undoing the ending that so many fans had come to treat as sacred. The series premiered globally on the 11th of May, 2026, with a half-hour special explicitly designed to explain how the new stories fit into the established timeline, followed by a run of shorter, 11-minute episodes closer in format to the original series' classic style. In an interview given to Variety ahead of the premiere, Quintel remained largely tight-lipped about the specific mechanics of how the revival would handle continuity, but he made one promise directly and clearly, that everybody's questions would be answered once the special actually aired. Sit with the size of that promise for a moment, because it directly touches almost everything discussed so far tonight. A creator who spent 8 seasons quietly closing some doors and just as quietly leaving others standing open has now returned, nearly a decade later, with cast intact and stated intention to fill in exactly the kind of gaps that fans have spent years cataloging. It is not yet publicly known, at the time of this recording, precisely which of these specific mysteries the new series intends to touch. Whether Clorgbane's promised return finally gets its overdue second act, whether Thomas the intern's fate after the Dome's launch gets any acknowledgement at all, whether CJ reappears in some form, even briefly, now that the show has explicit permission to revisit its own timeline rather than only extend forward from it, whether the Guardians of Eternal Youth's larger institutional structure, the Immortal Student Council implied but never shown, gets any further shading. What can be said plainly, because it is a matter of public record rather than fan hope, is that the revival's entire premise is built around the specific claim that there is more footage, more material, more of this world that simply was not shown the first time, and that the showrunner has personally promised, in an on-record interview, that the audience's outstanding questions are part of what the new episodes intend to address. That is a genuinely unusual position for a beloved, tightly closed ending to find itself in nearly a decade later. Most finales that land, as well as this one, did get left alone, specifically because revisiting them risks undoing whatever made the original ending feel earned. This one is being revisited on the explicit premise that revisiting it does not undo anything, because the material was always technically already out there, waiting on tapes nobody had watched yet. It changes, a little, how you should think about everything discussed tonight. Every gap cataloged here so far, the unexplained breakup, the vanished spy, the unresolved rematch, the unnamed wife, the missing grave, has been treated as a permanent feature of the text, a door the show built and then chose, for whatever mixture of narrative and practical reasons, to leave shut. That was true and remains true for the 8 seasons that aired between 2010 and 2017. But as of this recording, sitting in mid 2026, with new episodes already airing on Cartoon Network and HBO Max, several of those doors are, for the first time since the finale aired, no longer necessarily permanent. This is worth stating with real care, because it would be dishonest to pretend certainty about outcomes that have not yet been shown. The revival does not automatically resolve any specific mystery discussed tonight simply by existing. Nothing here should be taken as confirmation that Clorgbane returns, or that CJ appears, or that Benson's history with Audrey finally gets its explanation. What can be said honestly is only this: a show that spent nearly a decade being remembered as a rare example of an animated series that ended cleanly, completely, without needing anything more, has now placed itself back in a position where at least some of its old silences might finally get broken by the same voices that built them, inside a framework the creator himself has openly described as designed specifically to answer outstanding questions. There is another category of gap worth naming on its own, because once you notice it, you start seeing it everywhere in this show, and that is the sheer number of important people who simply never receive a name at all. High Five Ghost is one of the 7 characters most central to the entire series, present in the founding cast from the earliest episodes, given a brother, a girlfriend, eventually a wife, a small house, a full domestic arc across 8 seasons. And across every one of those seasons, his actual given name, the name presumably printed on whatever paperwork exists for him in this universe, is never once spoken on screen. He is Fives to his friends, High Five Ghost in the credits, and nothing more specific than that in the text of the show itself. Muscle Man's mother occupies a stranger version of the same absence. She is one of the most referenced characters in the entire series without ever actually appearing in it. Muscle Man's catchphrase, built around bringing up his mother at wildly inappropriate moments for a cheap laugh, becomes one of the show's most reliable comic beats, specifically because the joke depends on her existing entirely off-screen, an absent figure invoked constantly and shown never, without even the dignity of an established name to attach to the running gag. Death's wife receives the same treatment as Mordecai's eventual bride, present, warm, clearly beloved, referred to consistently as simply his wife across every one of her appearances, never given a name of her own, despite raising a 300-year-old demon child and managing what the show frames as a genuinely stable, domestic life beside one of the most powerful entities in its entire cosmology. None of these omissions individually would mean very much. Plenty of shows leave minor figures unnamed without anyone thinking twice about it. What makes the pattern worth naming here is the specific shape of who tends to fall into this category across regular show as a whole. It skews consistently toward women positioned as stabilizing forces in male characters' lives. The wife, the mother, the partner glimpsed only in the finale's closing frames, present specifically to demonstrate that a male character has grown into someone capable of sustaining a real relationship without needing, in the show's own apparent judgment, an identity substantial enough to require a name that is not a claim about intent. Nothing here suggests the writers set out deliberately to build this pattern. It is simply what is left once you count carefully across 8 seasons. The men get names, arcs, catchphrases, specific histories. A surprising number of the women who complete their stories get a face, a role, and silence where a name should be. Return once more to the episode that reveals Thomas the intern as the spy, Nikolai, because there is a second dangling thread inside that same half hour that almost never gets discussed alongside the first. The episode does not introduce its Cold War plot with only one hidden agent. Benson, at the exact same moment Rigby grows suspicious of Thomas, begins dating a new woman named Natalie, who is revealed by the episode's end to be a fellow operative herself, working the exact same kind of long game from the opposite side of the conflict, embedded in Benson's life, specifically to further whatever the larger geopolitical plot actually was. The episode plays this reveal for a very specific kind of comedy, leaning hard into old spy thriller tropes, complete with a dramatic unmasking and a tense standoff before the situation resolves itself in the show's usual fashion. And then, exactly like Thomas, Natalie simply disappears from the narrative the moment the episode ends. She is never referenced again. Benson's romantic life continues across later seasons as though the entire relationship, real feelings, and false pretenses both, had simply never happened. There is no follow-up scene where Benson processes having been deceived by someone he was seriously involved with. There is no acknowledgement that an actual foreign agent had, however briefly and however comedically, embedded herself directly inside the park's social fabric through her relationship with its middle manager. The show treats the entire episode as a self-contained bottle story, sealed off from the ongoing continuity the moment its specific joke has been told, which is a perfectly normal thing for an episodic cartoon to do. And also, once you actually sit with it, a genuinely strange thing to do with a plot this serious in its own internal stakes. A hostile intelligence operation targeting the park, run by two separate embedded agents working in tandem, simply stops mattering the second the credits roll, and no character within the show ever appears to remember that it happened at all. The finale carries its own quieter version of this same unresolved accounting, this time buried inside the visual spectacle of its climactic battle rather than in any single episode's plot. During the fight's most intense stretch, Antipops, in his effort to eliminate any obstacle standing between himself and his brother, begins erasing people from existence outright, a power the show treats as genuinely catastrophic rather than merely dangerous. Entire crowds of allies and bystanders are wiped away in the span of a few frames, gone as completely as though they had simply never existed at all. The resolution to this, once Pops and Antipops' mutual death ends the ancient cycle of destruction and rebirth that has defined their conflict for billions of years, is stated plainly within the show's own internal logic. The ending of that cycle also reverses the damage done during the battle, restoring everyone Antipops erased back into existence. That restoration, however, happens entirely off-screen. The show tells you it occurred. It does not show you the erased characters actually returning, does not give you the reunion beat where someone who watched their friend disappear gets to watch them reappear again, does not linger on the relief that restoration would presumably bring to a cast that had just witnessed real, apparently permanent loss moments earlier. Fans discussing the finale in the days immediately following its broadcast raised exactly this concern directly, noting a specific dissatisfaction with never actually seeing the erased characters, including recurring allies and former villains who had joined the fight, confirmed alive and present again on screen. The show's own internal answer to the question is essentially, trust that it happened, because the logic of the ending requires it to have happened. whether that is a satisfying way to handle mass disappearance and mass restoration inside a story that has otherwise earned its emotional beats through careful, patient staging is a matter of individual taste. What is not a matter of taste is the simple fact that the show chose not to show it, leaving an entire cast of momentarily erased characters in a kind of narrative limbo. The finale asks you to resolve through inference rather than through anything actually depicted. Go back to Lollyland one more time, because there is a figure standing quietly at the edge of that entire final sequence who deserves more attention than she gets. Among the native beings the park crew meets on Pops's homeworld is a figure referred to simply as the Guardian of Lollyland, a being whose stated purpose, confirmed within the episode itself, is to observe and record every single confrontation between Pops and Anti-Pops across the entire history of their conflict, a conflict the show establishes as having repeated itself in some form across billions of years and countless prior incarnations of the same two souls. She shows the assembled crew ancient carvings depicting those earlier battles, images of past versions of the park's staff, standing alongside past versions of Pops in wars fought long before any of the current cast were ever born, a detail that quietly implies something the show never actually develops any further. That Mordecai, Rigby, Benson, Skips, Muscleman, and High Five Ghost may not be the first iteration of this particular group of allies at all. That something like this exact configuration of friends may have gathered around some earlier version of Pops in some earlier cycle, fought some earlier version of this same war, and either won or lost, in ways lost now to whatever version of history the Guardian alone still holds. The show raises this possibility for exactly as long as it takes to make the current battle feel weightier by comparison, and then moves on without exploring it. Who appointed the Guardian to this role? Whether she has any power to intervene in the battles she records, or whether her entire function is passive witness, forbidden by whatever rules govern her position from ever actually taking part. What happens to her once the cycle finally ends for good, since her entire purpose for existing was apparently built around a war that has now, for the first time in the show's own established history, actually been resolved, rather than merely reset? None of this is addressed. She appears for a handful of minutes, delivers exposition crucial to the audience's understanding of what Pops actually is, and recedes back into a role the show never asks you to think about again once her scene is finished. It is worth pausing here, honestly, and asking a slightly different kind of question than the ones asked so far tonight. Not what happened to any specific character, but why a show with this much clear affection for its own cast would build so many doors and leave so many of them standing open. One answer, the least romantic one, is simply the practical reality of how animated television gets made under real constraints. 8 seasons and 250 episodes is an enormous amount of material to sustain, produced across years by rotating teams of writers and storyboard artists working under network deadlines, budget limits, and a season order that Quintel himself has confirmed grew smaller in its final years. Part of what pushed the creative team to think seriously about how to end the show properly, rather than risk it simply being canceled out from under them without warning. Under those conditions, some threads inevitably fray. A joke episode about a spy subplot gets written, gets its laugh, and gets shelved, because there is no mandate requiring every single one-off premise to be woven back into the ongoing continuity, and doing so for every stray idea would likely have made the show feel cluttered rather than rich. That is the practical, unglamorous answer, and it is almost certainly true as far as it goes. But there is a second reading available too, one that is more speculative and should be treated as exactly that, a reading rather than a confirmed intention, and it has its own kind of quiet appeal. A show this attentive to the emotional texture of being in your 20s, a show that gave Skip centuries of grief over one lost relationship and gave Rigby years of arrested development rooted in a specific sibling dynamic, and gave Muscleman a whole arc about the gap between the man he performs and the man he actually is, clearly understood something true about how real lives actually work, which is that most relationships, most rivalries, most passing entanglements with strange and complicated people do not resolve into tidy closure. People break up and never explain why, even to themselves. Old feuds between coworkers persist for years without either party remembering, with any real accuracy, how they actually started. People you dated intensely for a season of your life sometimes simply stop being part of your life, and the story of exactly why often only gets told secondhand years later by someone who happened to stay in touch when you didn't. If that reading holds any water, and again, it is offered here as interpretation rather than confirmed authorial intent, then the show's willingness to leave certain doors standing open might not be a failure of craft at all. It might be one of the more honest things about how the show chose to depict adult life, more honest, in its own quiet way, than a version of the same story that insisted on explaining every single loose thread before the credits rolled for good. The finale's reception at the time supports at least part of this reading, even if none of the critics writing about it in early 2017 framed things in quite these terms. Regular Show closed its run to broad and largely enthusiastic critical response, eventually settling into a place among the more respected animated comedies of its decade, holding a 96% score on Rotten Tomatoes across its run, and having previously earned Emmy recognition during its broadcast years. Coverage of the finale specifically praised its willingness to commit fully to consequence, to actually let a beloved character die rather than finding some last-minute reversal, and to let its two central friends age into real, unglamorous adulthood, rather than freezing them in perpetual 20-something stasis, the way so many long-running comedies choose to do instead. None of that critical praise required the show to have closed every open question first. The ending was celebrated, specifically for its emotional honesty, for choosing to show real growth and real loss rather than manufactured spectacle, and that honesty, it turns out, coexisted comfortably alongside a version of the story that never told you what happened to CJ, never explained Benson's broken relationship, never brought Clorgbane back for the rematch his entire origin story had been building toward for years. Audiences accepted the ending as complete in the ways that actually mattered to them, which suggests, gently, that maybe not every open door needs to be closed for a story to feel finished. Some of them can simply stay ajar, quietly, at the edges of a house you have otherwise said goodbye to. There is one more piece of confirmed, documented information about the revival worth sitting with directly, because it touches one of the specific gaps named earlier tonight with unusual precision. In an interview given to the Regular Show, Wiki, in the summer of 2025, character designer Ben Adams confirmed that an episode centered specifically on Eileen was already in production for the Lost Tapes. This detail matters more than it might first appear, because Eileen's underuse during the show's final stretch was one of the more commonly voiced disappointments among fans discussing the original ending, particularly given how much focus was devoted to nearly every other member of the extended cast during the show's climactic space arc, while Eileen One of the longest running and most beloved recurring characters in the entire series was largely kept in the background. Head writer Matt Price has separately confirmed, again in an interview conducted with the regular show wiki rather than through any official press release, that the new series was expected to premiere sometime in 2026, a timeline that held, with the show's first half-hour special airing globally on May 11th of that year across Cartoon Network's international feeds, followed by a rollout of shorter, classic format episodes throughout the rest of the month. The exact total episode count reported across different outlets has varied somewhat in the lead up to release, with some sources describing a 40-episode order split into an initial batch of 10, followed by 30 more, at an unspecified later date, and at least one other outlet independently reporting a slightly different figure of 44 episodes at 11 minutes apiece. That kind of small numerical discrepancy is worth naming honestly rather than smoothing over, because it is exactly the sort of detail that tends to firm up only once a season's full episode order is formally locked and publicly confirmed by the studio itself, and reporting, compiled from interviews and industry sources in the months before a premiere, does not always agree perfectly on numbers that are still, at that stage, subject to change. What can be said with real confidence is the shape of the intention behind the revival, because Quintel has described it consistently across multiple interviews leading up to launch. Rather than picking up the story after the timeline the finale already closed, The Lost Tapes positions itself inside the original 8 seasons, filling gaps that existed alongside episodes audiences have already seen, rather than extending the story forward past the ending that so many people had accepted as final. Quintel has also indicated, in the same run of interviews, an intention to give more attention to side characters going forward, telling Variety directly that beyond Margaret and Eileen, other characters would be getting their own dedicated episodes as the revival continues. A statement that at least raises the possibility, without confirming it outright, that some of the more thinly sketched figures discussed tonight, the vanished Thomas, the disappeared Natalie, even minor recurring faces like the snack bar staff or the various guardians and cosmic beings glimpsed only briefly across the original run, might finally receive the kind of dedicated focus the original series never had the runway to give them. Rigby's voice actor, William Salyers, has offered his own reassurance on a related point that fans raised as soon as the revival was first announced, stating plainly that the new series does not undo what many people, himself apparently included, consider one of the best series finales in the history of American animation. That reassurance matters because it draws a clear line around what the revival is actually trying to be. It is not a retcon. It is not a second ending competing with the first one for legitimacy. By its own creative team's account, it is closer to an excavation, a deliberate act of going back through footage that, within the show's own internal fiction, always technically existed, and finally choosing to show some of it. Whether that excavation actually reaches down into the specific silences cataloged across this entire video remains, as of this recording, genuinely unknown, and it would be dishonest to promise otherwise. Nothing here should be read as confirmation that any particular mystery gets solved. What can be said honestly, with the full weight of everything documented across interviews, wiki confirmations, and public statements from the people who actually make this show, is that the door has been reopened in a way almost nobody, watching the original finale in January of 2017, would have predicted was coming. A story that ended with genuine, hard-won finality, a story whose ending was praised specifically for choosing consequence over convenience, has been handed a second chance to revisit its own edges, not by contradicting what came before, but by adding to it. If Clorgbane's rematch is sitting somewhere in that unreleased footage, we do not yet know. If Benson's history with Audrey, or the true fate of a Russian spy named Natalie, or the years CJ actually spent building a professional dodgeball career somewhere off the show's radar, turn out to be among the stories still waiting on those old tapes, nobody outside the writer's room currently knows for certain. What we do know is that the person most responsible for building all of these silences in the first place has now said, on the record, that he intends to start answering some of the questions they created. There is a small, strange corner of the show's mythology that almost never comes up in these kinds of discussions, mostly because it never involves a main character at all, and that is the white elephant, the anthropomorphic guardian of the white elephant gift exchange ceremony that Muscle Man and the rest of the park crew accidentally stumble into during their attempt to get revenge on him for one of his elaborate pranks. The rules of this ceremony are treated by the show with a strange, almost religious seriousness. Gifts are meant to be things you do not actually want, not things you secretly hope to receive, and violating that principle, treating the exchange as an opportunity to acquire something genuinely desirable rather than to participate honestly in its spirit of good-natured disappointment, is framed as a real transgression, one severe enough that the white elephant sentences the offending party to an eternity trapped inside his temple as punishment. What the show never explains is where this ceremony actually comes from, who the white elephant answers to, if anyone, or how a specific human party tradition, one grounded entirely in a real and recognizable custom that long predates the show itself, came to have an entire cosmic entity built around enforcing its rules with genuinely supernatural authority. Nothing about the white elephant's history is given even the thin explanation the show offers for figures like the guardians of eternal youth or death. He simply exists, already established, already powerful, guarding a tradition whose actual stakes, outside of this single episode, are almost aggressively mundane. It is one of the purest examples anywhere in the show of a piece of mythology built specifically to serve one episode's premise, treated with total conviction for the length of that episode, and then never returned to or contextualized within anything larger ever again. There is also a genuinely interesting mystery buried in how differently certain episodes were treated depending on where in the world they aired, and the clearest example of this involves the very episode that revealed Thomas's identity as a foreign operative. International broadcasts of The Real Thomas, along with the complete series releases sold on DVD outside the United States, made a series of specific, documented edits to the episode's content. References to Russia were replaced entirely with a fictional stand-in country called Druzhnia, softening a joke that in its original American broadcast form leaned directly on real, recognizable Cold War iconography and, more pointedly, on visual references to a real sitting president of the actual Russian Federation. Beyond that renaming, several individual jokes and moments of violence were altered or removed outright for international audiences, changes that are documented and comparable side by side between broadcast versions. What is not documented anywhere, at least not publicly, is the specific internal reasoning behind exactly which edits were made, who requested them, or why American audiences were considered acceptable recipients of jokes that international broadcasters and home video distributors judged too sensitive or too specific for audiences elsewhere. It is a small, very concrete example of a much larger and much less visible process that shapes almost every piece of American media distributed globally: the quiet, largely unpublicized negotiation between a show's original creative intent and the different standards, sensitivities, and political realities of the dozens of markets a series like this eventually gets sold into. Regular Show rarely touched anything this directly tied to real-world politics and real, still-living public figures, which may be exactly why this particular episode required more careful handling once it left its country of origin, and why the specific record of that handling remains one of the more oddly precise, oddly underdiscussed mysteries connected to the show's international life. Even a detail as basic as how many episodes of Regular Show actually exist turns out to carry a small amount of genuine, documented disagreement. Wikipedia's own entry on the series finale states plainly that the show closed out after 8 seasons and 244 episodes. Variety's coverage of the finale, published around the same time the episode actually aired, describes the show instead as concluding after 8 seasons and 250 episodes. Neither number is being presented here as more authoritative than the other, and the discrepancy almost certainly comes down to differences in how various specials, shorts, or multi-part episodes get counted individually versus collectively across different tracking methods, a common enough issue with any long-running animated series that mixes standard episodes with half-hour specials and serialized finales. It is a genuinely minor thing, the kind of detail that would never normally earn its own moment in a video like this one. But it is worth naming precisely because it is minor, because it demonstrates something true about even the most straightforward, seemingly settled facts connected to a show this large. Even the plain, countable architecture of how much Regular Show actually exists is not perfectly agreed upon across every source that has ever written about it, which should make you a little more forgiving, honestly, of every larger, more emotionally weighted gap cataloged earlier tonight. If reputable outlets can't quite agree on the total episode count of a show that ended nearly a decade ago, it should come as no surprise that the show itself, made under real pressure by real people working real jobs, left a few of its own doors imperfectly latched. There is one last practical mystery worth naming before this settles into something quieter, and it concerns the park itself, the actual physical ground everything in this show has ever happened on top of. Mr. Maillard, Pops' adoptive father, is confirmed to die during the time skip between the crew's return from space and the 25-year reunion that closes the series, passing peacefully of old age rather than through any dramatic on-screen event. His death simply mentioned as part of the years that elapsed off-camera. Some fan-maintained sources describe ownership of the park subsequently passing to Benson, the character who had functioned as its day-to-day manager for the entire run of the show, though this specific detail should be treated with a bit more caution than the other confirmed facts discussed tonight, since it comes primarily from fan wiki summaries rather than a scene the show actually depicts on screen or a statement the creative team has made directly on the record. If accurate, it would mean the park's entire chain of ownership across the whole run of the series traces back to a single, unbroken lineage built specifically to shelter Pops from Mr. Maillard's original purchase decades earlier through to whatever final transfer happened once he passed, ending, fittingly enough, in the hands of the one employee who spent the entire series being the person most personally aggravated by everything strange happening on that land, without ever being told why any of it was happening at all. Benson, in this reading, would have spent years being kept out of the loop by circumstance rather than by any deliberate decision to withhold information from him, only to inherit, at the very end, the exact property whose secrets had been driving him quietly toward despair since the earliest seasons. Whether the show or its supporting materials ever confirm this transfer with real specificity, or whether it remains another detail assembled by dedicated fans filling a gap the text itself never directly addresses, is difficult to say with total confidence from the outside, and it deserves to be flagged honestly as exactly that kind of uncertain territory rather than treated as settled fact. Walk back through all of it now, slowly, the way you might walk back through a house after everyone else has gone to bed, checking each room once more before you turn off the last light. Benson's silence about Audrey, Jean's forgotten grievance, Thomas standing frozen in a crowd, watching a dome carry his coworkers into space, never seen again. Natalie disappearing from a plot that made her, for one strange half hour, into a genuine threat to national security, disguised as a middle manager's new girlfriend. CJ, glimpsed one last time through a crowd of children on a class trip, her actual fate written down only afterward in interviews by people speaking from outside the story rather than inside it. Clorgbane, launched into the stratosphere with a promise attached to his exile that the show itself never got around to keeping. Mona, remembered completely by the one person who loved her, and explained to no one, not even the audience, in terms of where the part of her that mattered most might actually have gone. The Guardians, granting immortality and demanding a dance in return, belonging to some larger council the show only ever gestures toward. Death, married, fathering a 300-year-old child, operating under rules the show lets you infer entirely from his behavior rather than ever stating outright. The guardian of Lollyland, standing watch over a war that repeated for billions of years before this particular version of the cast ever showed up to fight in it, holding memories of prior incarnations of Mordecai and Rigby and Skips that the show raises for a single scene and then quietly sets back down. High Five Ghost's actual name, Muscle Man's mother's face, the name of the woman Mordecai eventually marries, invented, in the end, not by the story but by a writer answering a stranger's question on the internet years after the cameras stopped rolling. None of these silences cancel each other out, and none of them undo what the show accomplished elsewhere. The friendships it built with real patience, the growth it earned, honestly, across 8 years of small character beats, accumulating into something that felt, by the end, genuinely hard-won. But it is worth being honest about what kind of show this actually was underneath its own reputation for tidy, satisfying closure. It was not a puzzle box. It never actually promised you that every object placed on the mantle in an early season would be picked back up and fired in the last one. What it promised, instead, and largely delivered, was something closer to the actual texture of remembering a place you used to spend most of your time in. Certain rooms stay vivid forever. Certain people's faces you can still describe in detail decades later. And certain other doors, for reasons that have nothing to do with how much you cared about what was behind them, simply never got opened again before you moved on with your life. The show trusted you to hold both of those things at once. The deep, earned satisfaction of watching Rigby finally graduate, and Muscle Man finally grieve his father properly, and Pops finally choose gentleness, all the way down to the very end, alongside the quieter, less comfortable knowledge that some of the people who pass through that park's gates simply walked out one day and were never accounted for again. That is not a flaw hiding inside an otherwise perfect structure. It might just be the most honest thing the show ever did without ever announcing that it was doing it. And now, after everything, there is a strange kind of grace in knowing the story is not entirely finished being told. 9 years pass between that final VHS tape being ejected and the moment Cartoon Network confirmed new episodes were actually coming. 9 years during which the ending simply sat there, complete, respected, occasionally revisited by fans hunting for exactly the kind of gaps cataloged tonight, but otherwise closed. It is closed no longer, not completely. Somewhere in a studio right now, animators who grew up alongside this exact cast are drawing new frames of characters they have known for the better part of 2 decades, working from a premise that treats every one of these silences not as a flaw to be quietly ignored, but as material that was simply waiting its turn. Maybe Clorgbane gets his rematch. Maybe he doesn't, and the promise stays exactly where it has always been. 157 years, still ticking somewhere in the show's own internal clock, patient, the way Skips himself has always been patient. Maybe Eileen finally gets the season she always deserved, and maybe somewhere inside that same batch of episodes, quietly, without any fanfare at all, a woman named Natalie, or a man once known only as Thomas the Intern, gets one more scene, one more chance to matter to a story that let them go too easily the first time. There is a detail buried inside the episode that finally reveals Pops's true origin that deserves far more attention than it usually gets, mostly because it passes by quickly, tucked inside a sequence built to deliver a much larger revelation. In the ice tape, the crew is trying to retrieve an old recording meant for Pops, something that will help unlock the truth of who he actually is. And the mission to secure that tape depends on the help of 3 human characters, ordinary people rather than park staff, who assist the crew specifically because of their devotion to Pops, and who ultimately give their lives in the process of making sure that tape reaches him safely. The show treats their sacrifice with real weight in the moment, staging it as genuinely moving, 3 people choosing to die, so that a being they clearly understood to be far more significant than he appeared could finally learn the truth about himself. And then, once the tape is secured and the larger plot moves forward toward the finale, those 3 humans are never mentioned again. Their names, their relationship to Pops beyond whatever devotion drove them to help in the first place, why they specifically, among however many humans exist in this world, understood enough about what Pops actually was to be willing to die, protecting his access to that recording, none of it receives any further explanation. They exist for the length of a single sequence, perform an act of real consequence, and then disappear from the story completely, unmourned by name in anything that follows, their sacrifice folded into the larger machinery of getting Pops to his final battle without the show ever pausing to ask who exactly they had been before that moment, or what it meant that ordinary humans somewhere already seemed to know Pops was worth dying for. A similar fate meets Chance Sure Shot, a character introduced amid the chaos of the space arc, specifically to help the crew during Anti-Pops's assault on the space tree. When Anti-Pops's forces use a tractor beam to try to capture the park dome, it is Chance Sure Shot who sacrifices himself, stepping outside the safety of the dome to shoot down the gunner responsible for the beam, buying the rest of the crew the time they need to escape. It is a clean, classic moment of heroic sacrifice, staged with the kind of clarity you would expect from a show that had, by that point in its run, gotten very good at building brief, effective emotional beats out of characters the audience barely knows. And once again, the show simply moves on. Chance Sure Shot does not reappear among the resurrected or restored once. Pops and Anti-Pops's mutual death reverses the damage of the battle. He is not mentioned during the reunion. Whether his death was understood within the show's own internal logic to be permanent in a way that other more central characters' brushes with death across the series were not, or whether the show simply ran out of narrative room to circle back and confirm his fate one way or the other, is left entirely to inference. He joins a fairly substantial list of characters introduced specifically to die meaningfully during the space arc's rush toward its ending, each of them given just enough characterization to make their sacrifice land emotionally in the moment, and none of them given the kind of follow-up that would tell you, with any real confidence, what actually became of them once the credits rolled on the episode where they mattered. These smaller, second-tier sacrifices matter for a reason that goes beyond simple cataloging, because they reveal something about how the show's final stretch was actually built under the pressure of condensing an ending. A season that spends real time establishing 3 unnamed humans willing to die for Pops, or a single soldier named specifically enough to earn his own heroic beat, is a season working hard to make its climax feel populated, feel like the stakes extend beyond the 7 characters the audience already loves, reaching outward into a wider world of people who also understand what is actually at risk. That instinct is a good one, and it mostly works, in the moment, exactly the way it is supposed to. But it also means the finale's emotional economy runs on a kind of controlled forgetting, introducing figures specifically built to matter for one scene, and then trusting the audience not to ask, afterward, what happened to them once their scene had done its job. Multiply that pattern across the sheer number of one-episode allies, one-scene sacrifices, and single-appearance native beings crammed into the show's final stretch, and you start to understand something true about how satisfying endings actually get built under real-time constraints. They are rarely built by tying off every single thread introduced along the way. They are built, the ones connecting Mordecai and Rigby and Skips and Pops and the rest of the 7-person core the show spent 8 years developing, land with real, earned weight, even if that focus requires letting dozens of smaller, perfectly real, perfectly named side characters simply recede into the unexplained edges of the frame once their specific purpose has been served. Go back further still, all the way to Death's very first appearance, because buried inside that early introduction is a fact so strange it tends to get skipped past, simply because the show itself skips past it so quickly. In Over the Top, Skips and Rigby end up in an arm wrestling contest, and Skips, not fully aware of his own strength, slams Rigby's head into the table hard enough to kill him outright. This is not a near miss the show later reveals to have been survivable all along. Rigby is confirmed dead, plainly enough that Death himself arrives to personally collect him, and the entire remainder of the episode is built around Skips, trying to win Rigby's soul back through a contest of strength against Death directly. He succeeds. Rigby is restored, alive again, and the episode closes on that restoration the way the show usually closes its more dramatic bottle episodes, with things basically back to normal by the time the credits roll. What never happens in any episode that follows is any acknowledgement from Rigby himself that he actually died. Not a passing reference during a moment of danger later in the series. Not a joke about it during one of the show's frequent flirtations with mortality in later seasons. Not even a beat where Mordecai, watching his best friend nearly die again in some later crisis, thinks back to the one time it actually happened, and Rigby had to be won back from death's own hands through an arm wrestling match. The show establishes this early and this plainly that death in this universe is negotiable, survivable, something that can be undone through the right contest against the right entity. And then it largely proceeds as though that fact does not meaningfully change the emotional stakes of anything that comes later. Characters still grieve. Loss still lands with real weight, Mona's death chief among them, treated as permanent and devastating rather than as something that might, in a universe where Rigby was once actually brought back from the dead through sheer competitive spirit, still theoretically be reversible given the right circumstances. The show never explains why some deaths, in its own established cosmology, are treated as negotiable inconveniences and others are treated as permanent, unbridgeable losses. It simply proceeds, episode by episode, trusting the audience to feel whatever the specific scene requires them to feel without ever reconciling those two very different sets of internal rules against each other. It is worth pausing on the actual numbers behind that finale for a moment, because they tell you something honest about how the ending was received in real time, before any of tonight's specific gaps had years to settle and calcify into the kind of thing fans discuss. The three-part finale aired on Cartoon Network on the 16th of January 2017, with its opening part drawing 1.3 million viewers, and its second and third parts each drawing 1.37 million. Figures that made it, by a clear margin, the single most watched episode of the show's entire eighth and final season. Those are not blockbuster numbers by the standards of primetime television, but for a Cartoon Network animated series airing its quiet, cosmic goodbye on a Monday evening, they represent a real audience choosing, in real time, to show up for the ending, rather than letting it pass by unwatched. Critics covering the episode in the days that followed were, on the whole, generous with it, with at least one major outlet later placing all three parts of the finale at the very top of a ranked list of the series' best episodes according to aggregated audience scores, praising the opening chapter's pacing and the closing chapter's emotional payoff in roughly equal measure. None of that critical or audience enthusiasm required a single one of tonight's open questions to have been answered first. People sat with an ending that never told them what happened to CJ, never explained Clorg Bane's broken promise, never gave Mordecai's wife a name on screen, and by every available measure of contemporary reception, they still walked away from it feeling like they had witnessed something whole. That is worth remembering as this settles toward its own close, because it suggests the gaps cataloged across this entire video were never actually a barrier to the ending landing the way it was always meant to land. They were simply always there, quietly, underneath an ending that worked anyway, waiting for exactly the kind of unhurried, wide awake at midnight attention a video like this one is built to give them. There is one more open question worth naming honestly before this settles into its close, and it is less about any single character and more about the shape of the entire project the Lost Tapes represents. A revival built on the premise that its new stories were always technically happening somewhere inside the original 8 seasons, simply unrecorded until now, carries with it a specific kind of risk that has nothing to do with quality and everything to do with continuity. Every new episode set inside that established timeline has to thread itself carefully between everything the original run already confirmed, matching established relationship timelines, established character knowledge, established emotional states at any given point in the show's chronology, without accidentally contradicting scenes audiences have already watched and built years of interpretation around. That is a genuinely difficult needle to thread, harder in some ways than simply continuing the story forward from where the finale left off, because forward motion only has to stay consistent with what came before it, while material inserted backward into an already completed timeline has to stay consistent with everything on both sides of it at once. Quintel and his writing team have said, on the record, that they intend to honor the original ending rather than undercut it, and Salyers' own public reassurance that the beloved finale remains intact carries real weight given his position as someone who has voiced Rigby across the entire life of this franchise. But intention and execution are not the same thing, and it will only be possible to judge, honestly, how well The Lost Tapes actually manages this balancing act once enough of its run has aired, for fans to compare it carefully against the specific timeline the original series already locked into place. If the new series does manage to answer some of the questions raised across this video, whether Clorgbane's rematch finally arrives, whether Thomas or Natalie or Chance Shershot or the three humans who died securing that old videotape ever get names and histories beyond the single scenes that made them matter, it will need to do so without quietly rewriting anything the audience already holds as settled. That is the real test sitting ahead of this whole project, larger than any individual mystery discussed tonight, and it is a test nobody outside the writer's room can actually grade yet, because, as of this recording, there simply has not been enough of the new material released to know for certain which way it will go. There is one real, non-fictional detail worth including here, gently, because it belongs to the same honest accounting this whole video has been trying to give. Julian Holloway, the British actor who voiced Death across the show's 2nd through 6th seasons, passed away on the 16th of February, 2025, at the age of 80, following a short illness. He built a long career before regular show ever cast him, appearing across decades of British film and television, and he came to the role of Death relatively late in that career, bringing a specific Cockney warmth to a character who was, on paper, meant to be frightening. Fans marking his passing at the time noted, with a kind of gentle, fitting irony, that the man who gave voice to death itself had finally met it in earnest, a coincidence that would feel too neat in a piece of fiction, but that carries its own quiet weight simply for being true. It seemed right to mention here, plainly, without dwelling on it longer than it deserves, in a video that has spent this long asking what happens to the people who pass through a story and are never fully accounted for afterward. Categorize, for a moment, everything gathered so far tonight, because the mysteries have not all been the same size or the same shape, and it helps to see the different kinds side by side, rather than letting them blur together into one general feeling of incompleteness. Some of what has been discussed is simple, quiet, interpersonal loose thread, the Benson and Audrey breakup, Jean's original grievance, the kind of gap you find in almost any long-running show once you look closely enough at its edges, because real writers working real jobs across real years cannot chase down every implication they ever raise. Some of it is a very specific kind of narrative debt, a promise made directly to the audience through the internal logic of the story itself, and then left unpaid. Clorgbane's 157-year cycle standing as the clearest example, a ticking clock the show built with its own hands, and then chose, whether by design or by circumstance, never to let finish counting down. Some of it is cosmological, the deepest and least apologetic category, the kind of gap that exists because the show was never actually interested in building out the full architecture of its own supernatural rules. Death's jurisdiction, the Guardian's larger institutional structure, the Guardian of Lollyland's exact authority, all of it sketched only as far as the immediate story required, and no further. And some of it, the unnamed wife, the unnamed mother, the unnamed ghost, sits in a category that is less about narrative mechanics and more about a pattern of attention about which characters this show consistently decided deserved a name and which ones it consistently let go without one. None of these categories require the same kind of resolution. A narrative debt like Clorgbane's can, in principle, still be paid. And now, with new episodes actually airing, that possibility is not merely theoretical anymore. A cosmological gap like death's exact jurisdiction might never be filled, might not even need filling, because plenty of shows function beautifully with gods and reapers whose full rulebooks the audience is never meant to see. And a pattern of attention like the unnamed women scattered across this show's ending is not really the kind of thing a single revival episode could retroactively fix anyway, because the absence itself, once noticed, has already told you something true about how the story was built, independent of whether anyone ever gets around to finally writing that name down on screen. Think, too, about how differently this all would read if the show had never gotten its ending at all. If the network pressure that reportedly shaped those final 2 seasons had instead simply canceled the series outright, mid-story, the way so many beloved animated shows before and since have quietly been cut off. Every single mystery cataloged tonight would still exist, but none of them would sit inside a completed structure, a finished house with a few doors left ajar. They would instead be scattered across an abandoned lot, indistinguishable from the 100 other threads a canceled show never gets the chance to resolve at all. The fact that these particular gaps can be discussed with this much specificity, this much care, is itself only possible because the show around them was allowed to finish. That is worth remembering before the frustration of any single unanswered question gets too loud. An ending, even an imperfect one, even one with real silences built into it, is still something a great many shows never actually get. It is worth returning, one more time, to the specific feeling of finding a wiki page that simply stops, because that feeling has been the actual companion of this entire video from its opening line to now. There is no shame in a story having edges like that. Every story does, eventually, if it runs long enough and cares about enough people to build all of them out with real specificity. What makes regular shows' particular edges worth an evening like this one is not that they exist, but that they exist inside a show otherwise so carefully, so patiently built, a show that took the time to give Skips 3 centuries of grief and a proper reckoning with it, that took the time to let Muscle Man mourn his father honestly instead of just comedically, that took the time to let 2 grown men finally, awkwardly, say the things to each other that mattered, instead of letting the friendship simply coast on habit toward the end. A show with that much patience for the threads it did choose to follow makes you notice, more sharply than you otherwise might, the threads it quietly chose to set down instead. That noticing is not a complaint. It is closer to a kind of respect, the specific respect you extend to something built with enough care that its remaining gaps feel less like carelessness and more like the ordinary, forgivable shape of anything made by people, under deadlines, with limited time, who loved what they were building enough to at least try to finish the parts that mattered most. If you have made it this far, you have spent a long while tonight inside a place that never actually stopped being unfinished, and there is something fitting about ending a video like this one without pretending otherwise. The park is still standing, under whatever ownership actually holds the deed to it now. The Yeti is still on the porch, older than any of us will ever be, still refusing to walk when he could skip instead. Somewhere, a locket sits in a drawer that hasn't been opened in longer than most of the show's own characters have been alive. And somewhere else, on a set of tapes that were always technically real inside the fiction of this story, more of it is waiting, quietly, to finally be shown to you. That is where we leave it tonight. Not because everything has been explained, but because some of the best places you will ever spend time in are exactly the ones that never quite finish telling you everything they know. If this kind of slow, careful walk through the show's actual gaps is something you want more of, the best thing you can do is subscribe, because there is a lot more of this show left to look at closely, and more of it, it turns out, than any of us actually knew 9 years ago. And if tonight helped you drift off the way these videos are meant to, take that with you. Sleep well. The park will still be there tomorrow, whatever new tapes it turns out to be holding, and so will every one of these quiet, unfinished corners, waiting patiently for the next person who decides, on some other dark and unhurried night, to go looking for them.